The desert stretched wide and cruel beneath a sun that burned like a forge. Dust rolled off the red hills carrying the smell of sage and iron. Every sound seemed to echo in the stillness. The creak of a wagon wheel, the far-off cry of a hawk, the slow rhythm of wind scraping over dry stone. Out there, a man could lose his way or lose himself, and no one would ever know the difference. Hartwell's post sat at the edge of that emptiness, a small trading outpost made of cracked timber and grit. It was a place where trappers brought pelts, soldiers bought whiskey, and secrets changed hands as easily as tobacco. The roof leaked when it rained, the porch sagged, and the sign out front had long since lost half its paint. But to the few who survived between these ridges, it was the only flicker of life for 50 miles. Inside, Ayanna worked in silence. The Apache girl had lived with the Hartwells since she was 8 years old, taken in after soldiers burned her village near the San Pedro River. Widow Margaret Hartwell had raised her out of practicality more than kindness, teaching her to scrub, mend, and cook, but never to belong. To most folks who came through, Ayanna was a shadow, half native, half tame, wholly unseen. She moved through the yard with quiet purpose that day, splitting mesquite logs behind the barn. Her brown arms flexed beneath the sun, her dark braids swung down her back, and a thin scar traced her cheek like a whisper from another life. She worked without complaint, the rhythm steady, crack, breath, lift, drop, each strike echoing across the empty land. From the porch, Evelyn Hartwell watched her with thinly veiled disdain. Evelyn was everything her mother wanted the world to see. Pale, fine-featured, trained to smile just right. Her dresses came from Tucson freight wagons, her speech carried the lilt of far-off schooling, and she moved through the dust as though it didn't dare touch her. She called Ayanna the help, but she used the word like it meant something smaller. The afternoon dragged heavy until the wind shifted. Out beyond the rise, the steady beat of hooves broke the quiet. Heads turned. A lone rider came out of the shimmer, horse lathered with heat, coat dark with sweat and trail dust. The man rode straight through the yard like he'd been here before and tied off his buckskin at the post. Jacob Thornton. Men at the porch stopped talking. The name carried weight out here. The kind of man who lived too long in the mountains, trapping through winters that broke lesser men. He was tall, sun-browned, with lines carved deep around eyes that saw everything and offered nothing back. His coat was made of deerskin patched with time, and his boots were scuffed from more miles than anyone cared to count. They said he'd buried a wife years ago, or maybe never had one. They said he'd fought off bandits in the Sierra Madre, traded with the Chiricahua, and hunted wolves for sport. Nobody knew for sure, and Jacob never corrected the stories. That evening, Widow Hartwell laid supper under the cottonwood out front. Venison stew, cornbread, and strong coffee. Evelyn sat in her finest dress, every hair in place, her smile practiced to shine. The men who lingered to see the mountain hunter whispered that if Jacob Thornton had come for a wife, it would surely be her. But Jacob ate in silence, spoon steady, eyes sharp. When he nearly finished, his gaze drifted beyond the table, across the yard to where Ayanna knelt by the woodpile, stacking logs. The red sun caught her skin in a bronze glow. Her face was turned away, strands of black hair clinging to her neck, and sweat darkened the front of her faded dress. He watched her longer than he meant to. Evelyn noticed. She leaned forward, her voice sweet as syrup. "You've been awful quiet, Mr. Thornton. I hear you're staying in these parts for a while?" He didn't look at her. He took a sip of coffee, eyes still fixed on the woman by the woodpile. "Maybe," he said. Then after a beat, "Who's the one behind the woodpile?" The words landed like a hammer. The widow blinked, surprised. Evelyn froze mid-smile. "That's Ayanna," Margaret said slowly, her tone caught between apology and discomfort. She helps around the place." Thornton nodded once, still watching the Apache girl as she wiped her brow and lifted another log. "She looks like she knows how to work." Evelyn forced a laugh, sharp and brittle. "She's hardly the company you'd—" But Jacob was already standing, hat in hand, his eyes never leaving the figure in the fading light. No one at Hartwell's post knew it then, but that single question, "Who's the one behind the woodpile?" was the beginning of a story that would turn their small world upside down. And by the time the next storm rolled over those red hills, The stranger from the desert would no longer ride alone. The morning came dry and sharp, with wind crawling across the desert like an old hand brushing the dust. Inside Hartwell's post, Widow Margaret was polishing the same counter she'd been scrubbing for 10 years. She didn't look up when Jacob stepped through the door. The floorboards groaned under his boots. He smelled of pine smoke, horse sweat, and the kind of silence that made men uncomfortable. Evelyn appeared at the top of the stairs, sunlight sliding through her blonde hair like a halo. She was dressed finer than usual, blue ribbon at her throat, a bit of perfume that didn't belong to this land. "Well," she said, smiling wide, "I heard you were still around, Mr. Thornton." Jacob nodded once, polite but distant. His eyes swept the room, not lingering. Evelyn's smile wavered. She had spent half the night practicing what she'd say if he came calling. Yet the man looked at her the way a mountain looks at a butterfly, aware, but unmoved. He took off his hat and turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I came to ask a thing." Her hands stilled on the rag. "And what might that be?" He hesitated only long enough to make the silence heavy. Then he said, steady and clear, "I came to find a partner. Not a pretty face. I'll ask for Ayana's hand." The room froze. The coffee pot hissed on the stove. Someone outside dropped a crate. Evelyn's smile collapsed into something raw. "What did you say?" she whispered. Margaret's eyes darted toward the back door, where Ayana had gone to fetch firewood. "Surely, Mr. Thornton, you don't mean—" "I mean exactly that," he said. "The Apache girl. She works hard, doesn't speak when there's no need, and she's not afraid of dirt or silence. That's the kind of woman who survives out there." Evelyn's face turned pale as bone. "She's help, not—" But Jacob's tone cut through her like a blade. "She's a woman, that's enough." Out back, Ayana stood at the doorway, half hidden in shadow. She had heard every word. Ash still clung to her fingers from the stove, and the scent of smoke followed her like a ghost. For a moment she thought she'd misheard. This man, this stranger, couldn't have meant her. When Jacob turned and saw her standing there, he didn't flinch. He walked toward her, his boots grinding over the dust. Evelyn's breath hitched behind him. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. He stopped a few steps away. His voice came low and steady. "You don't fake smiles, you know how to work. You remind me of the land, rough but honest." Ayana's jaw tightened. The land had taken everything from her. Her people, her home, her peace. She met his gaze, unflinching. "The land doesn't love back, Mr. Thornton." He nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for that answer. "No," he said, "but it keeps you alive." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Outside, a crow cawed and took flight, its wings dark against the sun. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice brittle. "Well, if that's your wish, Jacob, then I suppose, yes." She glanced at the ledger under the counter, at the numbers written in red ink. Maybe she saw practicality where the rest saw scandal. Evelyn turned away, her face a storm of disbelief and humiliation. "You'll regret it," she spat before climbing the stairs. Her boots struck the wood like hammer blows. Jacob tipped his hat, said nothing more, and left to tend his horse. The door creaked shut behind him. That night, Ayana sat on the porch with a bucket of kindling, her hands still trembling, though the desert wind had gone still. Inside, Evelyn's muffled sobs bled through the walls, sharp as needles. Margaret moved quietly between rooms, pretending not to hear. The fire outside snapped and hissed. The light danced across Ayana's face, tracing the faint scar on her cheek. She pressed a hand over her heart, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar, something heavy and uncertain. She stared into the fire and whispered to the night, "Why me?" The stars above didn't answer. The wind carried only the faint smell of mesquite and rain. But far off in the dark, a wolf howled, long, low, and knowing, as if the desert itself had already chosen for her. 3 days passed before anyone saw him again. The desert had swallowed Jacob Thornton as it did most men, quietly, without promise of return. By the third sunrise, Ayana had convinced herself he was gone for good. She told herself that was fine. Men like him belonged to the wild, not to women who lived in the corners of other people's houses. The morning was soft and gray when she went down to the creek. The air smelled of wet sage and the faint sweetness of mesquite blooms. She carried a basket and a small knife, kneeling by the water to cut bunches of yarrow and mint. Her reflection shimmered in the current. Dark hair, tired eyes, and that thin scar across her cheek that no amount of sunlight could erase. A horse's hoofbeat echoed from up the ridge. She didn't turn right away. The desert had taught her that silence answered better than words. Jacob Thornton reined in his buckskin at the edge of the creek. Dust clung to him, and the brim of his hat cast a shadow across his eyes. He didn't dismount at first. He just sat there, looking down at her like a man who'd rehearsed a sentence too many times. "I live hard," he said finally, his voice low, worn smooth by wind and years. "No luxury, no safety. I don't offer love, only honesty." Ayanna didn't move. She kept trimming herbs, her knife flashing in the sun. "Then be honest," she said quietly. "Why me?" Jacob took off his hat and held it by his side. For a long moment, only the creek spoke between them. Then he answered. "There was a woman once, back east of the Chiricahuas. She said she wanted a man who could build a life. I built her a cabin, cut her wood, hunted her food. Then a cavalry officer rode through and took her away. Left me a note and a debt on the same day." His eyes were somewhere far away now, past the mountains, past the years. "After that," he said, "I stopped waiting for good things." Ayanna finally looked up. The wind stirred her braid against her shoulder. "The heart breaks in all languages, Jacob," she said softly. "But it still beats." He studied her face as if he could memorize it. "You sound like you've seen too much to be that young." "I've seen just enough to know when someone's lying," she replied. "And you're not." Thor gave a short, rough laugh, one that seemed to surprise even him. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I'm heading north tomorrow," he said. "You'll know where to find me if you decide to come. Read this when I'm gone." Before she could answer, he turned his horse and started up the trail. His shape grew smaller between the cottonwoods until the desert light swallowed him whole. Ayanna waited until the sound of hooves had vanished. Then she wiped her hands on her dress and opened the note. The words were written in a firm, uneven hand. "Your silence follows me. It shouldn't, but it does." She read it twice, then folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest. The paper was warm from the sun, but the feeling it stirred inside her was something else. Something she hadn't known she was still capable of. Behind her, the creek murmured and glimmered over smooth stones, carrying its own quiet music down through the valley. Somewhere far off, a hawk called across the canyon, lonely and clear. Ayanna stood, the basket of herbs forgotten at her feet. She looked toward the red horizon where Jacob had disappeared. Her heart beat a little faster, stubborn and alive, like a wild thing remembering its pulse. She didn't smile, but the corners of her eyes softened, and for the first time in years, she felt something growing inside her that wasn't fear or loss. It was small, fragile as a seed carried by the wind. But it was hope. The preacher rode in on a mule the color of storm clouds, with a Bible in one hand and dust on his boots thick enough to count as sin. Travelers like him passed through Hartwell's Post every few months, men who carried the word westward and drank whiskey eastward, depending on who was watching. That morning, the wind smelled of rain. Clouds piled over the mountains like cattle moving slow. Ayanna was out back sweeping the porch when she saw Jacob Thornton ride in again, his hat pulled low, his eyes unreadable. He dismounted without a word and tied off his horse. "The preacher's here," he said, voice steady as ever. "Let's not wait." Ayanna froze, the broom slipping from her hand. Widow Margaret Hartwell, standing in the doorway, blinked as though she hadn't heard right. Evelyn, at the counter polishing a mirror that didn't need polishing, went still. "You mean today?" Margaret asked. Jacob nodded once. "Today's as good as any." Evelyn let out a short, bitter laugh. "You can't be serious." Jacob didn't answer her. His gaze stayed fixed on Ayanna, calm and certain, like the land itself. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Margaret sighed, muttered something about "what's done is done," and sent Evelyn upstairs to fetch her Bible. The ceremony took place that afternoon under the cottonwood tree behind the post, the biggest one for miles, its pale leaves trembling in the wind. The preacher stood before them, hat off, wiping sweat from his brow. A few traders and ranch hands lingered nearby, drawn by curiosity more than respect. Evelyn came out last, dressed in black lace as if attending a funeral. She stood behind her mother, jaw tight, eyes bright with something cold. Ayanna wore a plain gray dress that had once belonged to Margaret. She'd mended it herself, sewing new seams over old ones. Around her shoulders she draped a fox fur shawl, soft and warm, the same one Jacob had traded her months before. It was her only ornament, her quiet symbol, part wilderness, part hearth. When Jacob took his place beside her, the preacher cleared his throat and began. His voice carried through the dry air, each word landing heavy on the ground. Holy union, vow, husband and wife. Jacob's hands were rough and scarred from years of work. Ayanna's were smaller, brown and calloused. Yet when he took them, the fit was right. Solid, simple, true. I ain't got a ring, Jacob said quietly. Just my word. Ayanna looked up at him, her eyes steady. Then I'll take that. A ripple of murmurs ran through the onlookers. Someone snorted. Another spat in the dirt. He married an Apache, one man whispered. Ayanna heard it, but she didn't look away. Her chin lifted just slightly, proud as the hawk circling above. Jacob noticed, and something like a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The preacher shut his Bible with a soft thump. By the authority vested in me, he said, you may kiss the bride. Jacob hesitated only a breath. Then he leaned down and brushed his lips against hers. Brief, gentle, but real. It wasn't the kind of kiss you'd find in dime novels or city chapels. It was a promise between two survivors, spoken without words. The men at the edge of the yard laughed nervously, unsure whether to mock or marvel. Evelyn turned her head away. Margaret just crossed herself, half out of habit, half out of disbelief. Jacob placed his hat back on, turned to his horse and offered Ayanna his hand. She took it without hesitation. Together they mounted and rode toward the horizon, where the mountains rose red against the falling light. The preacher watched them go, his voice low. Strangest wedding I ever gave, he said. Margaret didn't answer. She was staring after the pair, two small figures riding west, side by side, swallowed by dust in the setting sun. For Ayanna, the wind off the plains carried no blessing, no song. But as the cottonwood leaves rustled behind her, it felt, just for a heartbeat, like the world had gone quiet enough to let her begin again. A marriage without flowers. No lace, no choir, no rings. Only sky, dust, and the courage to walk into both. They rode for a full day after the wedding, leaving behind the cottonwood tree, the whispers, and the stairs. The road thinned into rock and sand, winding up into the high country, where the air cooled and the land opened wide. The sun slipped behind red cliffs that looked as if they'd been carved by fire and wind centuries ago. When the horses finally stopped, the valley below glowed like copper. A small cabin stood near the edge of a pine grove, its roof patched with bark, smoke rising lazy from a stone chimney. It wasn't much, just a single room, a porch barely holding together, and a creek singing softly not far away. But to Ayanna, it looked like the first real home she'd ever seen. Jacob swung off his horse, untied the packs, and said simply, "Here we are." Ayanna took it in silently. The rough-hewn logs, the wooden door hanging slightly crooked, the sound of water running through the stones. Everything about it was imperfect, yet honest. The scent of pine sap and wood smoke filled the air, sharp and clean. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A table, a bed made of furs, a few tools on the wall. Jacob had built it with his own hands. You could see it in the uneven beams, in the way every nail sat slightly off-center but held strong. "This is how I live," he said, setting down the gear. "It's hard. Cold in winter, dry in summer. No neighbors but the coyotes." Ayanna ran her fingers along the edge of the window frame. "It's quiet," she said softly. Jacob nodded. "Quiet's a kind of peace out here. Takes getting used to." That evening, they worked side by side. Jacob showed her how to salt and hang meat from the rafters, how to pack jerky for long hunts. Ayanna, in turn, taught him the Apache way of reading signs in the wind, how a shift in the breeze could tell when deer were near or when rain was coming. "You listen to the land," she told him, crouched beside the creek as dust settled. "It speaks if you stop trying to fill the silence." He smiled faintly. "Guess that's something I've never been good at." When the stars came, they lit the sky in silver dust. The fire inside the cabin threw soft light across the walls, painting shadows that danced with the smoke. Ayanna laid out a blanket near the hearth while Jacob stoked the flames. Neither spoke much that night. The air between them was steady but uncertain, like two travelers who had found the same trail by accident. They shared a meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, each spoonful eaten slow, deliberate. When it was time to sleep, Jacob motioned toward the bed. "It's the only one I've got," he said awkwardly. Ayanna looked at him for a long moment, then lay down on one side, turning her back to him. Jacob settled on the other, keeping a full arm's length of space between them. The fire cracked. Outside, a wolf howled somewhere in the pines, its cries stretching across the valley like a thread of sorrow and freedom. Minutes passed before Jacob spoke, voice low, almost lost to the wind. "Summa, thank you for not running." Ayanna stared into the flicker of the fire. The light caught the curve of her cheek, the dark shine of her hair. "Where would I run?" she whispered. "The mountains already know my name." Jacob didn't answer, but his breath eased. The sound of it mixed with the steady rhythm of the night, the creek flowing, the wolves calling, the soft whisper of wind sliding down from the peaks. Ayanna closed her eyes. For the first time in years, the darkness didn't feel like something closing in. It felt like something keeping her safe. Outside, the moon rose over the ridges, bright and cold, bathing their small cabin in light. Two silhouettes lay side by side, a space between them still wide as the desert, but smaller than it had been the night before. In that fragile quiet, surrounded by wilderness and starlight, something began to settle between them. Not love yet, but the shape of it. By midsummer, the mountains had turned cruel. The creeks ran low and bitter, and the air shimmered with heat so fierce it bent the horizon. Even the pines seemed to hold their breath. Ayanna had gone down to the stream that morning with a tin pail, her feet bare against the stones. The water looked clear, cold enough to sting, but somewhere upstream, a dead deer had fouled the flow. She drank without knowing. By dusk, a fever burned through her like wildfire. Her skin went pale, her lips dry, her breath shallow. She tried to stand, but the world tilted sideways. The pail spilled, water seeping into the dirt. When Jacob found her, she was collapsed against the rocks near the creek, her braid tangled with leaves. For a moment, he thought she was gone. He dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulder, his voice cracking in a way it never had before. "Ayanna, can you hear me?" Her head lolled to the side, eyes half open but empty. Jacob gathered her up, lifting her like something sacred, her weight light but terrifying in his arms. He carried her all the way back to the cabin, stumbling over roots and stones, the mountains echoing with his breath and her silence. Inside, he laid her on the bed and stoked the fire high. He soaked a rag in cool water and pressed it to her forehead, his hands trembling. Outside, thunder grumbled in the distance, rolling across the ridges like some old god watching. All that night, and the next, Jacob stayed awake. He boiled water, crushed herbs, changed claws as she burned and shivered. He spoke to her, though she couldn't answer. His voice broke down from steady to desperate. "Don't die on me, Ayanna, not you." Her fever dreams came in waves. She saw fire in the sky and heard the voices of her ancestors calling from the high peaks, whispering in Apache, words she hadn't heard since childhood. They beckoned her toward the light above the ridges, but there was another voice, deeper, rougher, calling her back. Jacob's, his hand gripping hers, his heartbeat steady against her skin. Each night bled into the next. He refused to sleep, afraid that if he closed his eyes, she'd slip away for good. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and fear. The wind rattled the shutters. The world shrank to the space between her breath and his hands. On the fifth dawn, the fever finally broke. The sun poured in golden and clean, cutting through the haze of smoke. Ayanna's skin cooled beneath his palm. Her breathing steadied. Jacob, sitting beside her, slumped forward, exhaustion finally dragging him under. His head rested on the edge of the bed, one arm draped across her hand. His fingers were still curled around hers as though letting go would end the spell. When Ayanna opened her eyes, the room came slowly into focus. The soft crackle of dying fire, the smell of rain just beyond the door. She turned her head and saw him asleep there, unshaven, hollow-eyed, a man carved by worry. For a moment she just watched, hardly breathing. No one had ever stayed for her before. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his temple. The motion stirred him. He blinked, disoriented, then looked up at her, and the relief that washed over his face was raw, unguarded. "You're awake," he rasped. She tried to speak, but her voice came out a whisper. "Why?" Jacob frowned slightly, not understanding. "Why did you stay?" she asked again. He sat back, eyes dark with something deeper than weariness. After a long pause, he answered, Because you stopped being a stranger. For a while, neither said anything more. The mountains outside hummed softly with life again, the creek murmuring, the pines sighing in the wind. Jacob leaned back in his chair, too tired to smile, but his hand still rested over hers. Ayanna stared at the ceiling beams, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. Outside, the morning light spilled over the peaks, washing their little cabin in gold. The fever had taken much from her, but left behind something fierce and quiet, a heartbeat that no longer belonged to her alone. And as the wolves cried far up the slope, Ayanna closed her eyes once more. Not from weakness, but from peace. She was alive, and someone had cared enough to make sure she stayed that way. By the time autumn rolled down from the high peaks, the land had gone mean again. The summer heat broke into sandstorms that rose like ghosts from the desert floor, howling through the canyons and scraping the world raw. The first storm came with a sky the color of copper. Jacob Thornton nailed the shutters shut while Ayanna brought in the drying herbs from the porch. The wind clawed at the door, the cabin groaning under its weight. Then through the haze of blowing grit, a lone rider appeared, tall in the saddle, horse white with dust. Jacob squinted through the crack in the shutter. "Someone's coming." The rider stopped in the yard. When the wind died just enough, Ayanna saw her face, and her stomach turned cold. Evelyn Hartwell, her stepsister. Dressed in travel-stained silk, hair pinned high but wild from the wind, she looked like she'd ridden straight out of the past and into their quiet world. Evelyn dismounted with practiced grace, brushing the sand from her coat. "Well," she said, voice dripping honey and venom, "I came to see if my dear sister's still breathing in this hole." The room went still. The storm outside filled the silence, wind slapping against the door. Ayanna stood near the fire, her expression unreadable. She didn't step forward, didn't offer a greeting. Jacob moved beside her, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. Casual, but ready. Evelyn's eyes drifted over the cabin, the simple furniture, the smoke-stained rafters, the herbs hanging to dry. "So this is your grand new life," she said. "A palace of pine and dirt? Charming." Her gaze cut to Jacob. "And this is the man you married?" Jacob didn't answer, only met her stare with the cool patience of someone who'd stared down wolves before. Evelyn smirked, unfazed. "Tell me, Mr. Thornton, what's it like being married to a half-blood wife? Must be exotic." Jacob's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Ayanna still didn't look up. She simply stirred the pot on the stove, the quiet scrape of the spoon louder than Evelyn's words. Hours passed like that, Evelyn talking, Ayanna silent, Jacob keeping watch. By nightfall, the storm had locked them in, the wind shrieking around the cabin like a living thing. Evelyn refused to leave, claiming the roads were too rough. Jacob didn't argue. He wasn't about to send a woman into that storm, but he didn't hide his displeasure either. Dinner was eaten in near silence. The only sound was the storm's breath against the walls and Evelyn's occasional sigh of disapproval. She picked at the stew like it offended her. When Jacob went to stoke the fire, she leaned back in her chair and said softly, almost lazily, "You know, folks in town are saying something." Jacob paused. "Folks always are." Evelyn smiled. "They say your bride can't bear children. Everyone knows it." The spoon in Ayanna's hand froze midair. For a heartbeat, the world was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then Jacob straightened slowly, turning toward Evelyn. His voice came low and even, the kind of calm that hides danger. "Then everyone's wrong." Evelyn blinked, startled by the steel in his tone. Jacob stepped closer, the firelight catching the lines of his face, hard, steady, and fierce. "And you," he said, pointing toward the door, "get out." Evelyn's composure cracked. "You'd send me into that storm?" "Better the storm than my house," he said. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ayanna stood, walked to the door and opened it. The wind roared in, scattering ash and dust. She met Evelyn's eyes, not with anger, but with something colder. Pity. "You came to see if I was breathing," Ayanna said softly. "Now you know." Evelyn hesitated, pride battling fear. Then she pulled her shawl tight and stepped into the storm, the wind swallowing her curse as the door slammed shut behind her. Jacob stood still for a long time, chest rising and falling. When he finally turned, Ayanna was already at the window, watching the storm carry her sister's shadow away. "She'll find her way back to town," Jacob said quietly. "I know," Ayanna replied. "The desert keeps the cruel alive longer than it should." Outside, the storm raged on, beating against the walls like an angry heart. Inside, for the first time, Ayanna felt something deeper than fear, something fierce and unspoken, pulsing in the quiet space between them. Jacob poured another log on the fire, sat beside her, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her said enough. "You are not alone." And in that flickering light, while the desert screamed beyond their walls, Ayanna realized the storm outside wasn't half as wild as the one she felt inside. The storm hadn't quieted. It clawed at the cabin walls, howling through every crack like a living thing. The wind made the shutters tremble, the fire hiss. But the loudest sound of all was the one inside the room. Evelyn's laughter. She stood near the door, rainwater glistening in her hair, her face pale but proud. "You can't love her," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You only pity her." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jacob Thornton didn't move at first. He stood near the hearth, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. Ayanna was by the window, her fingers gripping the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the flames as if they could burn the words away. Evelyn took a step closer. "You think marrying her makes you noble? She's a charity case, Jacob, nothing more." Jacob turned then, slowly, like a man deciding whether to speak or to draw. His eyes found Evelyn's, cold and steady as a winter sky. The muscles in his jaw worked before he finally said, low and controlled, "You should leave." Evelyn's lips curved into a cruel smile. "I'll leave when I'm done. You might fool yourself, but everyone knows what she is, what she isn't. You can't love something that doesn't belong anywhere." Fire popped. Sparks drifted up the chimney like tiny stars dying. Jacob took a step forward. His voice deepened, rough with something rawer than anger. "I said once I didn't know how to love." Evelyn blinked, the smirk faltering. "I lied." He turned toward Ayanna. The storm seemed to pause for a heartbeat, the wind holding its breath. His gaze locked on her, steady, unflinching, the way a man looks at something he'd crossed the world to protect. "She's the only thing I ever wanted to protect," he said, "and I'll die before I let anyone shame her again." The room went still. Even the wind outside seemed to listen. Evelyn stared at him, stunned. "You'd throw away your name for her?" Jacob's reply came quiet but sure. "I already did." Ayanna's breath caught. Her throat tightened as tears blurred the edges of the firelight. She had never asked for love. Not from the world, not from him. She'd expected survival, maybe peace. But this was something different. She covered her mouth, trying to stop the sob that broke through anyway. It wasn't the sound of pain, it was release. The kind that comes when a wound finally begins to heal. Evelyn looked from one to the other, her face shifting through disbelief, hurt, and fury. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her pride, her certainty, all of it cracked under the weight of what she'd just witnessed. Jacob didn't say another word. He simply turned back to the fire, jaw set, done with her. That silence, more than anything, told her she no longer had a place in his world. Evelyn's hand trembled as she reached for the door. She hesitated, one last attempt at control flickering in her eyes. "You'll regret this, both of you," she said. Ayanna stepped forward then, calm, her voice steady as stone. "We already regret enough." Evelyn's chin lifted, but the fight had drained from her. She pulled open the door. The storm hit her full in the face, tearing at her hair, flinging sand and rain across the threshold. For a moment, her silhouette stood framed against the lightning, beautiful, bitter, and broken. Then she was gone, swallowed by the dark. The door slammed shut under the wind's weight. The fire flickered low. Jacob stayed where he was, staring into the flames. Behind him, Ayanna wiped her eyes and stepped closer. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. He looked over his shoulder, eyes softer now. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I did." Outside, the wind shifted, its howl fading into something gentler, almost like a sigh. The storm was passing. Ayanna sank down beside him, her hand finding his on the edge of the table. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't made of distance. It was made of understanding. The night still smelled of rain and ash, but inside their little cabin, something sacred had changed. The wind, the air, and the space between two people who finally saw each other for who they were. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains like a silent army. By November, the trails vanished under drifts of white. The creeks froze over. The air burned in their lungs, and every sound, the snap of a log, the creak of wood, felt sharper in the cold. Inside their small cabin, Jacob and Ayanna lived like two sparks in a world of snow. The storm outside could howl all it wanted. Inside, the fire never went out. They rose before dawn each morning, breath hanging in the air, and faced the kind of cold that could break lesser hearts. Jacob chopped wood while Ayanna mended furs, her fingers quick despite the chill. Some days they hunted together, tracking deer prints through the white silence, sharing glances more than words. Other days they stayed in, reading from the few books Jacob had hauled up years before, weathered pages of poetry and old Western tales. When Ayanna stumbled over a word, Jacob would grin, low and quiet. "Ain't no shame in learning," he'd say. "And you," she'd tease, "can you read the wind better than a page?" He'd glance toward the window where flakes swirled against the glass. "Most days, yeah. The wind don't argue back." Nights were softer. They'd sit by the fire, her head resting against his shoulder, both of them watching flames lick the wood. The world had called them unnatural, an Apache woman and a white trapper. But in that cabin, they fit together as if the land itself had meant it so. One night, as the snow piled high against the door, Ayanna spoke quietly, her voice a thread between the crackling logs. "The world called me cursed." Jacob looked up from sharpening his knife. "Who told you that?" "Everyone," she said, "since I was a child. Said the spirits turned their faces from me. Said I'd bring loss wherever I went." He set the knife down, met her gaze across the firelight. "The world's full of fools." She smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered. He reached over, rough hands brushing hers, and for a long moment, neither said another word. The only sound was the snow whispering against the walls and the soft sigh of the fire. The days blurred after that, each one a fight against the cold, but also a quiet rhythm of trust. Together they patched the roof, dug out the door, repaired the traps when the snow eased enough to let them out. Once, they even laughed as the roof leaked during a thaw, Jacob swearing under his breath while Ayanna held a bucket and teased him for building with more heart than skill. As winter deepened, so did the peace between them. The silence no longer felt heavy, it felt earned. Then sometime in late February, Ayanna woke before dawn, nausea twisting her stomach. She pushed herself from bed and stepped outside, the snow glowing blue under the moonlight. The world was still and endless. She pressed a hand to her belly, breath catching. Something inside her, small, fragile, but fierce, stirred. When Jacob found her by the fence, her cheeks were wet, though she wasn't crying. She turned to him, voice trembling between laughter and awe. "The spirits didn't forget me." He didn't ask what she meant, he just understood. His hands went to her shoulders, then her face, rough thumbs tracing the lines of tears. For the first time, Jacob smiled without reservation, a real, full smile that reached his eyes. They stood there in the snow, breath mingling in the freezing air. Above them, the mountains gleamed white, sharp and silent as sentinels. The wind had changed. It no longer bit. It hummed softly, wrapping around them like a blessing. Back inside, Ayanna curled beneath the blankets while Jacob added wood to the fire. He sat beside her and took her hand, rough fingers closing around hers. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The world outside could judge, lie, or forget. But within these four wooden walls, they had written their own truth. And that truth burned steady, bright, and alive, like a flame refusing to die in the heart of winter. Spring came like a promise kept. The snow melted into small, laughing creeks that tumbled down the slopes, feeding the thirsty earth. The pines whispered again, and the red cliffs glowed like fire when the sun rose. And there, in that world of light and rebirth, Jacob Thornton came into the world, crying, wild and perfect. Her skin was the color of sun-warmed clay, her hair black as midnight water. When Jacob held her for the first time, his rough hands trembled. The man who had once said he didn't know how to love now wept without shame. Ayanna watched, eyes soft, a small smile curling through her exhaustion. "She looks like you," Jacob murmured. "No," Ayanna whispered, her voice barely a breath. "She looks like the land." Outside, the wind shifted through the cottonwoods as if it agreed. The months that followed were the gentlest they had ever known. Jacob built a cradle from pine and carved small mountain patterns along its sides. Ayanna sang the old Apache lullabies, low and rhythmic, while the fire painted gold light over their faces. The cabin, once a shelter of solitude, became a home filled with laughter, soft footsteps, and the quiet heartbeat of a family. Years rolled by, carried on the steady rhythm of seasons. The valley changed, but their home only grew stronger. Jacob added new rooms with his own hands. Ayanna tended a garden where herbs, corn, and wildflowers grew together. Travelers sometimes stopped by, trading salt, flour, or stories. They'd whisper about the trapper and the Apache woman on the mountain who lived like the old spirits, half legend, half real. They didn't mind the talk. The mountains had taught them not to live by other people's words. One evening, while cleaning an old chest, Ayanna found a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased, tucked inside a leather pouch. The writing was faded but still strong. "Your silence follows me. It shouldn't, but it does." She remembered that day by the creek, when Jacob had left those words behind, thinking she'd never answer. She sat at the table, candlelight trembling across the page, and took a piece of charcoal. Under his old words, she wrote a new line. "You once said my silence followed you. Now your voice lives in every breath I take." She smiled faintly and placed the note back inside the pouch. This time, she tied it with a small braid of her hair and hung it above the door, where wind and light could find it. By the time Tala turned 6, she was already half wild like the hills that raised her. She followed her father through the canyons, learning the bow and the way of the wind. From her mother, she learned the songs of the earth, the names of herbs, the meaning of quiet. On some evenings, Ayanna would watch them from the porch. Jacob's laughter would echo across the valley as he guided Tala's small hands to steady the bowstring. Near the edge of the woods, a family of young wolves would watch, tails flicking. Tala, fearless and curious, often played near them, her giggles mixing with the distant calls of coyotes. As the sun sank low, painting the cliffs with blood-red light, Ayanna stood beneath the cottonwood tree, the same one where she'd once been married in a gray dress in trembling silence. Her heart was full now. Not loud, not proud, just full. The land stretched before her, endless and alive. She could feel its pulse beneath her feet, the roots winding deep through the soil like memories. She had come from shadow, from whispers and doubt. Yet now she stood as part of the mountain itself, rooted, enduring, free. Behind her, Jacob's voice carried through the twilight, steady as the wind. "Easy there, little one. Feel the bow breathe before you let it go." The arrow flew, clean and sure, vanishing into the horizon. Tala squealed with delight. Ayanna closed her eyes and whispered into the evening air. "The land remembers those who love without pretending." And as the last light faded behind the red mountains, her voice melted into the wind. A song, a promise, a spirit that would never leave this place. They said later that if you stood in that valley at dusk, you could still hear her laughter carried on the breeze, and see a wolf pup and a little girl running through the grass, while a man with kind eyes watched them. A family carved from earth, sky, and love strong enough to outlast time. The woman once unseen had become the spirit of the mountains. In Dufham,